Hello and welcome to Forbidden Talk, the social talk show covering taboo topics in the Middle East. This week we shall be exploring what it means to be a transgender person in the Middle East today. Never before has the transgender debate been more alive than in the West today. Transgender meaning when a person's gender identity is different to what society expects based on the person's sex assigned at birth. However, with traditional gender roles so heavily entrenched in the Middle Eastern culture, how could transgender people possibly live a life free from discrimination there? According to human rights groups, 40 transgender persons, normally sex workers, were murdered in Turkey in 2011. In contrast, last month, the Iranian parliament advanced a bill that would strengthen legal protections for transgender people in the country. With this background in mind, what are the challenges the transgender community faces in the Middle East? What rights, if any, do they have? Is transgenderism even taken seriously as a valid choice for individuals? We'll be exploring these questions with a panel of experts, and at this moment I'd like to welcome my studio guests, Fatima, member of the London trans community, and Melhem Mansour, human rights and gender activist. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
But first, let's watch this brief report.
When Caitlyn Jenner revealed herself on the cover of Vanity Fair, she was titled the most famous trans woman in the world. But the glamour and fame she enjoyed is far from the reality of a vast number of transgenders. Like all corners of the world, the Middle East is no stranger to the transgender community. Israel's Dana International is the most well-known of the Middle Eastern trans women thanks to her 1999 win in the Eurovision Song Contest, along with Turkey's Bülent Ersoy. While homosexuality is forbidden in many countries such as Egypt and Iran, sexual reassignment operations are legal, and in some cases the authorities even encourage and subsidize them. In Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa in 1983 permitting sex change operations in cases of diagnosed transsexuality. But though transgenders are no novelty, the concept of transgender identity and even the idea that people who were labeled as male at birth could willingly transition to female is still relatively alien. Aside from the social pressure transgenders face, finding employment can often be a difficult task. A large number of transgenders in countries like Turkey, Egypt, Kuwait and Lebanon have had to turn to working in the sex trade, a life that can come with a heavy price tag.
Fatima, can you clarify what you define as transgender and cisgender?
Yes, certainly. I think it's fair to say that these terms are misunderstood because they are not part of the life experience for most people, and I hope I can actually clarify this. The term cisgender is used to identify people whose sex, biological sex and gender identity align. And this is borrowed from chemistry. In chemistry, you have isomerism, and this example here showing a chemical where two parts are locked together. If the lock goes the other way around, then that is the trans isomer, and that's effectively where the cis-trans analogy comes from, where the physical, biological sex and the gender identity mismatch, that's transgender, where they align, it's cisgender. So I'd say it's an oversimplification though. One of the things that's becoming very apparent now is that it's not a binary concept. We talk about people having height and weight, and similarly, gender is not binary either. There's a spectrum, and it goes from male to female to agender, where people perceive that they have no gender at all.
So it's more fluid?
It's far more fluid. And even now, as we explore the human genome, we're discovering that biological sex isn't binary either. So there's a lot of research needed to be able to get to the bottom of it and really start to understand it.
And how does transgender affect your sexual orientation? Because I think that's a confusing concept for some people.
Yes, I think that's another part of the misunderstanding, which is very unfortunate. And I can honestly say that they are two completely separate concepts. And the reason that it's misunderstood is because even in the medical community, in the academic community, some people don't draw that distinction. And when I came out just a little under a year ago, I can honestly say that my sexual orientation in future was the last thing on my mind. The one thing that really mattered to me and still matters to me predominantly is maintaining all my relationships. So the relationships with my family, my friends, the associates I've built up over the years. So yes, transgender people can end up being straight, gay, bisexual, or asexual, not having any motivations whatsoever, but it's effectively a separate concept.
Melhem, transgender, obviously a very buzzword at the moment. We're talking about it openly in the West. Is this the same in the Middle East?
I don't think it's a buzzword in the Middle East because it depends on the country, actually. In Arab countries where we are facing now different types of conflicts, I don't think transgender would be a buzzword among the struggle for different minorities, other minorities like women or religious minorities to survive inside their communities. Add to this, in Arab states specifically, the struggle and concern was about the homosexual community more than the transgender. The transgender was not giving a lot of attention because of different reasons. But it was a buzzword in Turkey, for example, and Iran. Turkey because of the murders of many transgenders in Istanbul and other cities, and in Iran because there was a discussion inside the Iranian parliament to advance a bill to protect the rights of transgender. Other than that, in Arab states, it's still like a taboo topic to talk about or to tackle. In some countries like Egypt, they mentioned about transgender in different capacities. We had a series called A Shout of a Female on TV, which tackled the issue of transgender man wanted to transfer to a woman.
Yes, yes, I was going to mention that later, but it'll be interesting to
but
hear
at least the Arabic media, especially in Egypt, they tackled this issue from a medical point of view, showing the challenges a transgender man or woman are facing in their daily life.
This was a talk show, wasn't it?
It was a movie series, like in different episodes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Well, Fatima, I just want to learn a bit about your personal story. At what point did you know you were a woman?
I think it's fair to say that it was a very gradual awareness that I generated, and has taken place over a very long time. Looking back, it's clear I was aware that there was a mismatch of my biological sex and my gender, but I couldn't actually rationalise it at all.
But was this as a child?
It was as a child, yes, from one of my earliest experiences, which I can now look back on and understand, which I didn't understand at the time, was when I started school. In the school playground, I was attracted to the games that the girls were playing. I wanted to join them. I wasn't the slightest bit interested in the rough pushing around games that the boys were playing. So I was excluded from the girls because at that age girls and boys don't mix. And I really was not interested in being pushed around, so I found myself isolated. I actually tended to go to the gates of the school and look at what was happening outside. So it was actually quite lonely even at that stage.
Did you tell anyone about that? Just think,
no.
your mum, I don't like those games, or...
No, I think one of the things that's actually quite clear is that children learn the tacit rules of society, how to behave, what's acceptable, what isn't acceptable, from peer pressure, from the way in which children get bullied, from the way in which they get admonished by parents. It's all something that you learn implicitly. You don't need to be told explicitly at all. So, I mean, there's two parts of it. Part of it is in the self, what one's own self-perception is, and part of it is how society expects you to behave and what is expected of you. And even at age, when I was at university, I took psychology and anthropology as subsidiary subjects in my final year, and that was an honest but really a rather misguided and naive attempt to try and understand myself better. So the fact that the anthropological element was there was something that made me realise that it was societal. And critically, in older human civilizations, including the American Indians and including tribes in Indonesia, they have the concept of more than two genders. So long before any medical interventions were possible for transgender people, societies had adopted ways of incorporating these people into their society. So that provided me with some comfort that it wasn't just my problem, it was society's problem too.
Yeah.
But living in a Western society, those options aren't open to me. And finally, really, it's as a last resort, I realised if I'm going to come out, I have to comply with the new set of rules on offer in the West.
And at what point was that?
This was literally a year ago now.
And how many years, how old are you, if I may ask?
Yes, I'm just in my early 50s.
So it's taken...
It's taken well over 4 decades.
And what triggered that? Just many different small things? Or?
I'll go into in more depth later, but it was effectively wanting to get on top of my depression, which had been a problem throughout adulthood. And the underlying causes have been many and varied, but the one consistent factor that had been there all along was my gender identity.
I'm going to ask about gender identity to both of you, but Melhem, what are the consequences of concealing one's gender identity?
Transgender actually are lost between two terms. We have patriarchal societies which conquered the society in Middle East and Arab countries because of culture and religion. The women's rights are usually also affected. That's what we know. And in addition, the LGBT community also affected in our societies and neglected. And transgender comes between these two identities, women and LGBT. And they are lost between these two groups to be the most disadvantaged minority in our societies. And usually, they are neglected and dismissed from their families, in most of cases, from the schools. That's why they leave their towns and villages and live in big cities where they seek some kind of protection because, you know, in big cities it's less vulnerable for them. And in very rare stories, we have transgender women or men who were successful in their careers or education.
Very rare.
Very rare, because most of them are dismissed from schools, from early education stage, and from their families. And they have all this, like Fatima said, all this pressure throughout the years affecting their psychology and the way they behave as well in society. Most of them, they face isolation. And then when it comes to the word itself, if I want to translate word transgender, doesn't exist in Arabic language, the word gender. It's mostly they use the term transsexual. So they want to define your sex, either man or woman, and this is the case of Iran, because they want you to be categorized under one gender identity, male or female, and that's why in Arab states they use transsexual, not transgender. We in our work with women's rights and LGBTQ communities, it was very challenging for us as a human rights activist as well to explain the word gender for the general public and policymakers, because gender is more about social roles, and that's what they need to understand. It's not about sexuality alone.
Fatima, talking about consequences of concealing your identity on a more personal level.
Yes, well, the term now used to describe the condition is gender dysphoria, where dysphoria means the opposite of euphoria. It's a feeling of unwellness in relation to gender. And the way in which I can best describe it in terms of how I experience it and how it is resolved is as an internal turmoil, that there's a duality, a split personality. And this is effectively what leads to the root of depression. People who suffer from depression, I hope, will be able to relate to this, that depression is characterized by having an internal bully, someone who's telling you you're not good enough, someone who's telling you that you're shameful, or in the case of being transgender, someone's telling you, look in the mirror, look what you see, it's not the way you are inside. So you have your own narrative, which is producing this evil, a vicious circle of conflict, and it can't be resolved. And that's why 42% of transgender people attempt suicide at some point in their lives. And this broken record just keeps on playing until they're able to deal with it. The impact on development is not dissimilar to what people experience if they've had neglect as a child or abuse. So it produces a weak sense of self. You don't actually know where you're heading in life. So you have lack of purpose, lack of direction. And in the absence of knowing what you should do, you just conform with what's expected.
And Fatima, you've decided to conceal your name today. Can you tell us why?
Yes, the reason is essentially that I'm very early in my transition process, and it's very much a process, not an event. That there's two parts to it which I would like to distinguish between, and I think this will help explain. There's the social transition and the medical transition. Medical transition is this relatively recent innovation, and it is effectively now maybe entering its second generation, but the social side is as old as our species. So social transition is about adopting the authentic gender role. It is about being true to yourself and true to everybody in your relationships. So coming out to someone on a one-to-one basis actually redefines that relationship. So coming out is not a term like talking to everybody at once. It is literally something that's very personal between the two people. Mm-hmm. And it's a process itself. It takes time. So for the family in particular, to whom we're very close, it produces the sense of bereavement, all the feelings of anger, resentment, fear, doubt, disbelief, and then finally, hopefully, resignation.
But did this
acceptance.
come up in your case?
Absolutely. So all my family members are really on their own journeys with me. And the same is true of my closest friends. So there are really 4 stages to it, which I think is probably true for accepting anything that's really challenging. What the first one is revulsion, where people actually find the whole thing revolting, and the people to whom I came out and disclosed, some of them just vanished from my life, so that they're the people who couldn't deal with it. Then there's tolerance, which is okay, we're okay with this, but that's not the same as acceptance. Acceptance is where people say, okay, you're fine as you, we'll relate to you. But beyond that is affirmation, and affirmation is very powerful because it's people saying, we can actually see what you're doing is incredibly challenging, and we actually think you're courageous for doing this. We'd like to be associated with you because you're doing this, and we can see the strength in it. And
Fatima, I'm going to have to invite my next guest, I'm sorry, but now joining us over the phone in Turkey is photojournalist Bradley Secker. Bradley, can you tell us a bit about your journey of photographing individuals from Iraq and Iran claiming resettlement on grounds of their sexuality or gender identity, and why you were inspired to take on this project?
Hi, Anna. Yeah,
Hey.
lovely to meet you. I apologize in advance about possible connection issues or wind noise. Probably not ideal for TV since I'm on a phone outside. But basically, the journey started in 2010, documenting the plight of gay Iraqi men seeking resettlement from Syria. They were not allowed to claim asylum in Syria itself because homosexuality is illegal, and Iraqis had different legal status in Syria. Then after that, in 2012, I continued the project which I've called Kutman, which is Arabic for the term to conceal or hide. It took me to Turkey, where I photographed a lot of Iranians, Iraqis that I'd met in Syria, and also other people I hadn't met that had just arrived in Turkey, and also Syrians more recently that have fled for reasons connected with either their sexuality or gender identity.
And Bradley, can you tell us about the characters you encountered? How were they discriminated against? What stories did you hear?
It's really a big range. Predominantly, I've mostly, with this project, interviewed and photographed gay men. There's been several lesbians in the project, and also several transgender people. But predominantly, it's about gay men in general, even though I would love it to be more incorporating to LGBT people, but it's just difficult for me as a male photographer in this region, firstly to meet women, and also to have access as a journalist to people maybe not who are willing to, for perfectly valid reasons, to reveal their identities, or who don't have any needs or want to be interviewed. So the problems really vary. I mean, from Iraq, for example, the people I interviewed from Iraq that were claiming asylum had issues, basically huge issues to do with militiamen hunting them down, whether they were actually gay or perceived to be gay by militia, very much like ISIS is doing to people now in Syria. Different militia groups in Iraq during 2006 onwards looked for men they perceived to be gay or they knew or thought were gay. Things, for example, interviewed people who had their throats slashed, had their anuses glued up, and were locked in a room with food so that they could eat, but then they couldn't go to the toilet, so that they basically would end up dying.
So who was doing it? It was the authorities doing that?
No, these are all the
militiamen. Yes.
The different militias from different militias in Iraq operating at the time, or even lone individuals, I guess, based on their interpretation of religious texts. They thought that they needed to cleanse Iraq of homosexuality or people that they perceived to be homosexual. And I'm sure these things also went on for people that were transgender, but less so for lesbians, I guess, because women were much lesser, visible in society.
And where do these refugees, where do they go? I mean, they've left their homeland, but is life better in Turkey for them?
Okay, for the Iraqis that I interviewed that were in Syria, I don't think life was better for them then, partly because in Iraq, although these killings were happening, homosexuality wasn't technically illegal and isn't, but in Syria it is. So many people didn't even open up to the UNHCR when they were doing their first interview about their real reason, about their sexuality or gender identity. A lot of them said it was because of religious reasons, they were minority, or they were targeted, or they were shelling. So even to that extent, people's applications for asylum or resettlement were discredited after 2 or 3 interviews when they finally said, actually this is because I'm a gay man or because I'm a transgender person, because they said, you should have said this at the first occasion. So, I mean, the people were scared to have actually admitted that to the UNHCR staff because they said either the people there working there were either religious or they believed were linked with some sort of militia, for example. But bringing it back to Turkey, I think definitely life is better in Turkey. The only issue I would say is something interesting and not so positive is for example, the Iranian asylum seekers. They're not allowed to live in big metropolitan cities like Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir. They have this sort of disbursement program where you have to live in cities like Denizli, Isparta, Kayseri, cities, fairly large cities in central Turkey. But they're also fairly conservative. And honestly, when I've been walking around with Iranian LGBT people I've been following and photographing, the reactions are quite astonishing. I mean, I've seen people almost have car accidents and motorcycle accidents because they're staring so much when they're driving past.
Oh, wow.
As for sort of social issues in terms of integration, I don't think it's really working so well, and I don't think that's specific particularly to the Middle East. I mean, I think transgender people anywhere in the world face a huge amount of discrimination. Even in Canada, where most of the Iranians are ending up going, I don't think they're really having so much of an easier life there, in my opinion.
Melhem, I'm just going to bring in Melhem here. Are you surprised by what you hear?
Not really. I would like to add a point that even inside the LGBT community, there's discrimination against transgender. And at least I know about Syrian LGBT refugees in Turkey that they faced lots of challenges, including the transgender Syrian refugees in Turkey, and some organizations, Turkish LGBT organizations, started to offer some help for them, social psycho support, especially for Syrians transgender who left to live in Istanbul because there was no other choice for them.
But why is that? Why is there discrimination within a group within a group?
It's something natural to have some kind of discrimination inside one group. I think it's more about the identity itself, the integration of transgender community inside the wider LGBT community is also one challenge for the transgender community, because what we see, for example, in Turkey, most of the transgender community members, they work as sex workers, and this would be a bit for homosexuals is something not appreciated. But we should understand as well the background and situation of the group and the challenges they face. But in the Syrian LGBT community as a whole, inside Istanbul and in the center, which offer a lot of support and help for them, we have both gays, lesbians, in addition to transgender.
Bradley, did you see support offered to the refugees there?
Yeah, and I completely agree with what the previous guest was saying about transgender people only, having limited job options and basically only having to be able to work in the sex work industry. I mean, that's a real situation, a very true reality. Basically, it's very sad and unfortunate, and that's also with the Turkish community. And I feel that there's also, I agree in the fact that there's a discrimination against Syrian, Iranian, other nationality, LGBT, or transgender people in particular, by other transgender people in Turkey and also by other LGBT people in general. The transgender community is very much facing its own struggles and difficulties, and those are not really shared by gay men or lesbians. They're very particular to the transgender community, in my opinion. Signs of hope and support, yeah, I mean, I'm very well connected with some elements of the Syrian LGBT community, mostly the gay men in Istanbul, through a lot of friends. My previous housemate, is the editor and creator of an LGBT magazine in Syria, which is online. There's a lot of activist groups meeting every week to discuss rights and also to form a kind of community, basically, themselves in Istanbul. Mostly Syrians, but there's also Iraqis there and other people from Egypt and the wider Arabic-speaking region. But the state support, I wouldn't say that that's there at all. I think it's mostly from NGOs and mostly from LGBT-focused NGOs, yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Bradley, for being with us today and sharing your views.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Fatima, what was it like growing up? What do your family say to you when you maybe express concerns?
I think for a great part of it is I was concealing it, and the reason is simply that I had no frame of reference. These days with the internet, I think people are far more enabled to actually be able to find out about their identities early on, but none of that existed for me. So it was just very bewildering, like being in a boat in the middle of the ocean and not having any sense of direction. So you get blown by the wind and the waves. You don't actually have any concept of what's really going on. There were signs all along. I was playing with my sister and doing lots of family building kind of games, and very frustrated that she'd never let me play the mother role. But at the time, again, I couldn't really relate to understand why that was. But anything as I already said, you find that you've got a perceived weakness, you conceal it, and you just basically make sure that nobody notices. And because of that, when I wanted to try and express myself, I borrowed my sister's clothes and dressed in them in secret. And I felt slightly better for it, but it didn't actually answer this question, why? That was the question that was always on my mind.
Melhem, how are transgender people treated by their families in the Middle East? I know we can't generalize, but
Yeah.
what's coming up?
It depends on the cultural and educational background of the family itself. Usually, I think like there's no, unfortunately, research or statistics about this type of question. But usually our observation throughout our work on ending violence against women or ending violence in general, human rights in Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt, we think like transgender mostly, they are more appreciated by the family than being gay or lesbian, because they think they connect it to being a biological issue or problem, and they treat it in this way. While, for example, for gays or lesbians, it's mostly they look at it as psychological problem, more or less. So, but that's on the other hand, it's like it's a depression over the transgender man or woman inside the family, because mostly it's not only something biological, it's something in the genetics, as Fatima said, and then integrated within its inside the personality of the transgender himself or herself. And then beside the family is one component, but you have, of course, the society, the local community, the society in school, in university, at work. All this affect how the transgender look at herself or himself and at the wider
Of course,
society.
but the family is quite an important element, right?
And unfortunately, in many cases, the family is victim of the society. In many cases, in small communities, because we have transgender everywhere, in small towns and villages, the transgender feel like that's why they need to escape to bigger towns and cities, because the family cannot do anything because they are victims of the society around them. So usually they are facing a lot of stereotypes and discrimination even inside their families. And I heard a lot of stories where the family themselves, they ask their member who's transgender to leave their town or city and move to another city because it's shame for them and cannot bear it anymore. So it depends actually on the family. We have cases where if the family is educated and can afford it, they could advise their kid to go to a doctor and to follow some kind of treatment. But on the other hand, we lack also specialization in this term in Middle East. We don't have a lot of doctors who are specialized in gender identity issues on biological and psychological point of view. And that's why we don't have a lot of concentration and focus over this topic in Middle East, because we don't have this specialization taught at universities, and we don't have a lot of medical grads who work on this issue as well.
Right, well, we have to move on now. Now I'd like to welcome Sagi Gahraman over Skype from the Iranian Queer Organization. Sagi, I'd like to begin by asking you about the fatwa Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran issued permitting sex change operations. Why is homosexuality punishable by death but not against gender reassignment?
Hello, Anna. Thank you for inviting me. And about the fatwa, I would like to clear this point by saying that the Ayatollah gave that fatwa to correct a sin. He was making sure that the person who is attracted to the same sex is not living in the same biological body. And so if somebody expressed the interest in the same sex, then he or she should have been corrected and with sex reassignment to go to the next biological sex. This was actually to correct homosexuals, to prevent homosexuals to live as they were and be attracted to the same sex. It was about correcting a sin by being attracted. So when he spoke with doctors at that time when he issued the fatwa, and they said, the person who has this interest is actually might have the wrong body, and we can correct the body for them. He allowed that. There is no reason in Quran. There is nothing in Quran to say why the God or Islam is against homosexuals. We don't have any good reason in Quran, so we don't know. Even I think if there was a very good reason, we could oppose that. We could say that we do not agree with that.
And Sagi, how do clerics interpret someone's desire to change sex? How do they justify it?
They justify it because they think if that person stays as they are in the society, they will spread a sin.
They will spread sin.
Being attracted with the same sex, because if you are in a woman's body and you think you are a man, your internal gender identity is of a man, but then biologically you are seen as a woman and you are attracted to a man, then it is very similar to homosexuality. So they want to put you in the right body. They think they are correcting this and preventing this sin in society.
And Iran's gay community are faced with transition or die, yet post-operation, are Iran's transgender people able to lead peaceful lives?
Not at all. Not at all. After the operations, they don't have the right and the needed care post-operations. They are actually left in the streets to care for themselves. And then they are not hired in any governmental or private offices. They cannot rent an apartment to live in. Landlords are against that, and they are not accepted by their families and by society in general.
So where do they go?
They can be still victims of honor killings. They might go, in most cases, to prostitutions or be, as they say, sira or concubine of men who keep them and pay for their keep and use them as paid prostitutes, or they leave Iran and go to another country, which is not any better than their condition in Iran.
And what are the steps a trans woman or trans man need to take in order to be granted surgery?
They normally are found out by their parents because they are different and act differently as the norm says. Then they express this need to act the way they think they should as their internal sex and gender. They go to institutions which are placed in every large city in Iran. There are approximately 12 sessions for this person by medical and mental health professionals. Sometimes they are lucky and the professionals explains to them what is their condition and give them a choice to decide what they want to do after that. And sometimes the professionals, medical health professionals, try to encourage them to go for the operations. There is one session with a family member, and then the family is involved, which means that in most cases, the person is forced to undergo the sex reassignment. Then they gotta go to a court and get a permit from the court. The court sends them to forensics agencies. They should get a permit from the forensic professionals there. And then after that, they are permitted to have the operations, but in most cases, they don't have the money.
So it seems like there are a lot of people deciding the fate of the individual.
It is sad that there are 270 individuals every year apply for these sex reassignment operations, and they get permits and are operated on. The procedures are very different, of course, for female to male and male to female. There is not a good and practice. Very expert surgeons to do these operations. The transsexuals are left with many side effects, many pains, and many damages to their bodies after the operations.
And what does your organization do to help, Sagi?
We provide information online by written material, audio tapes, and video tapes. We prepare UPRs and we submit these UPRs, and we give information by Skype, by phone, by emails to the individuals. And then if they leave the country, go to transit countries or to the host countries, we follow up their cases with the UNHCR offices or with the immigration courts, with the embassies, and follow up until they are resettled in a third country.
Well, thank you so much, Sagi, for your contribution today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Melim, I'd like to move to Egypt, not literally, but talk about Egypt against LGBT people and the trans women that have been singled out more than any other group. It's been said that they are picked on more than any other group. Is this fair? Are trans women picked on more than trans men?
In case of Egypt, we have this full report by Amnesty talking about the harassment against transgender or transsexual communities, because that's interesting, because in Egypt they consider these transsexual or transgender, whom most of them working as prostitute for them. So they are arrested based on having illegal sex action. The interesting thing, they are arrested based on their ID card, gender in their ID card, not on the gender they like to be expressing themselves. So if they are male or female, so they are arrested based on their gender on the ID card. And here comes the beginning of other kind of harassment and challenging they gonna face, because all the other challenges they face inside the society, now they face other challenges. They face the harassment by the police officers, and we had a lot of cases where police officers not only harassing transgender or gay communities, also harassing young people in general. We have a lot of reports about this. And then the other challenge, when they are separated inside the prisons, so we have, if she's transgender and wanted to express herself as a woman, but she's in the ID card, she's a man, she's directed to a main prison. And inside the main prison in Egypt, we have a lot of cases where prisoners having or facing long-term imprisonment, and they find this transgender man or woman inside their prison as sex object for them, and another cycle of harassment starts there. And this is said by some police officers themselves in Egypt, not by only the victims. And then if they are referred to a psychological hospital because they think that's it's biological or psychological problem, here comes another harassment, because they are directed to mentally disabled people hospital, where she's treated as mentally disabled. And this is also one of the challenges the transgender community is facing in Egypt when they are arrested by the police officers. So it's like wide, small, different kind of harassment and abuse they are facing in that community. And gay men also, they are facing the same, but at more limited, in limited capacity. Transgender, because they are caught in prostitution, so there's already a stereotype inside the heads of these people that they should abuse them sexually.
Fatima, have you experienced anything remotely like that in the West, or various elements maybe?
Well, thankfully not myself. However, I should say that at the time in my teens, when my mother discovered that I had been cross-dressing, her response was hostile, and it effectively led to me becoming very self-repressed. And at the time I thought that that was detrimental to me, but knowing trans people of my age, a trans woman who actually disclosed her identity as a child spent most of her childhood and adolescence in an institution where it was deemed curable, and she effectively was robbed of her normal childhood.
Mm-hmm.
So that is Britain just in the late 1970s.
Has your mother come to terms with it now?
I think that fundamentally for her, the investment of any mother in their child is the greater investment, so it is much harder for her to accept that I'm changing than for any of our other relatives. And at the moment, unfortunately, she's not accepting.
And how about other people in the community? How they treated your parents?
I think with compassion and understanding primarily. There hasn't really been ostracism at all, and I think that probably has a lot to do with the fact that society in Britain has become a lot more tolerant.
Okay, well, now moving on to our next section, where we'll be asking whether the Middle East is ready to adopt a more flexible view on gender stereotypes. Melhem, generally across the Middle East, it's got a very patriarchal legal system. And so men have greater rights than women. The privileges over women are greater. So in the case of gender reassignment, is it the case that a trans woman loses her status according to the legal system there?
Absolutely. I guess the transgender are not tackled as issue of gender, unfortunately. As I told before, they deal with transgender on the sexual context only, not on the gender context, and this is one of the challenges in the legal system and the human rights practice in different countries. And within the struggle of women on gaining gender equality in a lot of Arab countries, transgender are left over. I haven't heard of any women rights group also including transgender rights inside their struggle to gain gender equality. And usually gender equality, because of this patriarchal society, it's explained as women-men equality, not based on gender roles. And this is one of the problems we are facing in Middle East. It was faced by Western societies as well before, but now we are dealing with this same problem at the moment.
Well, I was going to ask Fatima, do you think people perceive you as weaker now?
I think they do, and I think a very key important thing to understand here is how this relates to privilege. I think most people are unaware of the privileges they possess until they come under threat or they lose them. And people who are disadvantaged in the first place are very conscious of not having those privileges. So in the context of the social transition which I'm going through, I'm clearly losing male privilege. And so I agree entirely that feminism is actually very important to transgender people in order to address the new issues which arise.
And I guess we need a lot of debate over this issue, especially for our society is also religious-based society.
Yes.
And we need more discussion over this topic from religious leaders, from Christian and Muslim leaders inside our societies in order also to influence the legal system and policy makers.
Doing that?
Not at the moment. One of the trainings we tried to do with different religious leaders before is on sexual education and sexual health, including sexual health over the most affected communities, including transgender, but still in the sexual education context, not on gender context. But we need a lot of debates over this subject from theological scholars in order to influence also policymakers.
Well, now I'm delighted to welcome Yiska Smith, Jewish educator, spiritual mentor and author, over Skype in Jerusalem. Yiska, I'd like to talk about your experience growing up. When did you realize you were female?
I think as far back as probably when I was approximately 5 years old. It was in the incident that happened where I very clearly felt I'm a girl, and I went into this trance watching my mom, may she rest in peace, prepare to go out for the evening. And she wanted me instead to go and watch my father shave in the bathroom, and I asked her why. And she said, well, because you're a boy. And it shook me out of my trance, and I said, no, I'm to myself, no, I'm not, I'm a girl. But somehow I'm in the body of a boy. And this was in like 1956, so things were a little bit different then than now. So I buried it. It was a secret that I kept for many, many, many years. But
you've referred to growing up as being held captive. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I never hated my body. I never disliked my body because I never felt I was in my body. I felt the body that my soul, that my heart, that my mind inhabited was someone else's body. And there was nothing wrong with that someone else's body, but I literally felt that somehow, and I couldn't figure it out, at 5 years old, 10 years old, I was held prisoner in someone else's body, almost like a spirit that's like a Dybbuk almost.
Mm-hmm. Fatima, can you relate to that?
How else to say it? You know, it wasn't where, again, I didn't hate parts of me. I just felt I was not in the right place.
Yiska, I'm just asking Fatima if she can relate to that confusion almost.
I certainly relate to the confusion. I think it probably manifests in different ways for different people. For myself, I didn't see myself as having the wrong body. I just saw this incongruity which I couldn't rationalize at all.
And Yiska, as Judaism requires men and women to pray separately, how did you cope with this challenge?
It was very difficult because I gravitated very much towards the spiritual teachings in Judaism, and that brought me further and further into the Orthodox world, both in New York and in Israel, where there is a clear, as you mentioned, separation between a men's space and a women's space. It was very problematic for me. For years and years and years, almost 20 years, I felt I was on the wrong side of the divider, the mechitza in Hebrew. And there I am trying to pray to God from a place of truth, but from a place where I was not being authentic about where I belonged. So there was a lot of inner turmoil, and it was not pleasant. It was very painful, very, very painful.
And what triggered you to have a gender reassignment surgery at the age of 50?
Yeah, well, the surgery, unbeknownst to many, many people, is the very last step of a process. It's it's a several-year process. I mean, for me, it was several years. It started at 50, and the surgery really was the conclusion of this multi-step process. And what began it was on my 50th birthday, I woke up to what I consider to have been the most painful, lonely, disconnecting day of my life. And I literally cried out to God and said, I can't breathe air into someone else's body while I am becoming lifeless. I was drained from having to try to live someone else's life. And that began, I said, I'm ready to live the truth.
And some people might wonder how gender reassignment surgery can coexist in an ultra-Orthodox Jewish lifestyle. I mean, I know you feel differently, but can you tell us how you feel on this matter?
Yes, well, according to the Jewish law, which does not differentiate between what people perceive to be as modern Orthodox, Orthodox, and ultra-Orthodox, but there really is no difference. There's just different ways of interpreting the law. The law clearly states that saving a life, it's called pikuach nefesh, is of paramount importance. And there are many examples in Jewish law where we are told not only are we allowed, but we must, for example, desecrate the Sabbath laws in order to save a life. I knew at that point in time that my life was on the line. I didn't know what I would do if I didn't transition, but I knew I had to transition to save my life, to live a life. And at the end of the whole process, I became aware of a rabbi here in Jerusalem who actually passed a legal judgment when a male to female post-operative woman asked him, according to the Jewish law, how was she considered to be? And he says after a lot of research, he said she's considered to be a woman. He didn't say that it was okay to undergo the surgery. That was not asked of him. But according to his opinion, very well renowned, that Sitz Eliezer, he said that he decided she is to be considered a woman from a Jewish legal point of view.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Yiska, for sharing your views today. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Melam, is there a problem with how we label genders?
Yeah, for sure. Especially, it's a global problem in different spots of the globe, also in Middle East as well, because we are based, as I said, in this patriarchal society. So everything is genderized, as we say, from God to small elements. God is male in Arabic language, and then comes every other things to be labeled according to gender, like male or female. But as I said, it's a problem because we understand gender in this case in sexual context, not in the social roles of gender. It's not as in English or Latino languages where its gender is described as social roles. In Arabic, should come under also the sexual context, and here comes the problem. And usually it's a struggle for all communities, women, transgender, and LGBT, in order to unite all forces in order to change that. That doesn't come from the community itself. And amazingly, we worked a lot also on projects involving men in ending violence against women and in gender equality. And here comes also the role of men in working to work on this issue as well. It's not only struggle from the affected community itself, struggle also for men in order to understand how these terms also could be transformed into more modern interpretation within our societies.
In Fatima, Caitlyn Jenner and on Vanity Fair and Laverne Cox in The Orange is the New Black, are these role models for the transgender community?
I would say it's actually difficult for someone in the Hollywood bubble who has a very privileged, high-profile lifestyle to represent the transgender community, because it's impossible for us on any level to relate to their particular lifestyles. And though Laverne Cox has been making some efforts, she still has a certain degree of privilege. Their experiences of being transgender are radically different to those for most people in the West, where access to healthcare, employment and accommodation are really key concerns. And what we've been hearing today about people resorting to sex work is effectively as a move of desperation when effectively society has failed them and they have nowhere else to turn. Even in Britain, having been referred for a gender clinic appointment, the waiting time is 13 months, which reflects the under-provision. So it's not just a problem in the Middle East, it is across the whole world.
Just bringing in Melhem, do you think there's a problem with the press portraying the transgender community through Caitlyn Jenner? Do you think there's been a problem there?
I guess especially there's difference between the global press as well and the press in the Middle East, because our journalists also are not well trained over gender issues and over human rights issues. And here comes the problem, because a lot of journalists also tackle this issue in a very comic way, not in very professional way to talk about the gender identity of this person. And this affects also the readers and the viewers in Middle East. But I would like to add a point that we have also idols in Middle East who are transgender. We have a very famous Egyptian actress, Hanan al-Tawil, who was transgender. We have a famous belly dancer in Middle East. She was transgender. We have a Moroccan, very famous Moroccan presenter and actress at the moment. She's transgender as well. We have some members of the community who were challenging themselves to be role models for the community in Middle East.
But not trans men?
They are not trans men until now.
Well, moving on, now welcoming over Skype in Berlin, but usually in Tunis, Nicola Silva, Shuf Minorities, a feminist LBT organisation fighting against all forms of discrimination that target women's rights and bodies in Tunisia. Nicola, in a traditional Muslim country such as Tunisia, which is also known to be one of the most progressive in the Arab world, are they progressive in how they treat the transgender community?
Actually, in the way they treat the transgender, they are not really progressive. Like there is a big marginalization of the transgender community in Tunisia, like I think in all the MENA region, and by all sphere of the society. So actually, like there is a lot of police harassment, and also about all the administration works and stuff. It's really difficult for them to have a place in the society.
Mm-hmm. And earlier this year, Tunisian transsexual Jalel, formerly known as Layla, sparked debate after appearing on a popular TV show. So on one hand, you could say that his very appearance is very positive. However, there was a lot of negativity about his appearance from the public. How challenging is it for an organisation like yours to reach out and educate mentalities to be more open-minded?
Actually, the appearance of Jalal was positive as it gives visibility to an identity that is much more taboo than the L, the B, or the G. And it opens the debate in Tunisia. But the challenge that we are facing is that the mainstream discourse and also Jalal's one are based on mental or physical disorder. And they advocate transgender identity as coming out of disorders that once fixed with surgery or hormones therapy. It will fit in the heteronormative patriarchal social morality. Sorry.
And do you think the status of LGBT people has changed in Tunisia after the Arab Spring? Has it got better?
Actually, yeah. Actually, yes. For example, we have this example of the last World Social Forum, where it was the first time in Tunisia that that the LGBT community could walk in the street with the rainbow flags. So a lot more visibility than before, and also like the thing is with the new constitution as Article 2030 that criminalize homosexuality is this article become anti-constitutional with the new constitution. So if we create some alliance and we work with the civil society or with lawyers that have the same definition as us of the human rights, we can really at the moment change the things in Tunisia, I think.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Nicola, for being with us today and sharing your views.
No problem.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Fatima, of course, the argument is that's brought up by some people is that it might be confusing for children growing up in a household where maybe one of the parents is of transgender, a transgender person. What would you say to that?
I think that children are far more resilient than we give them credit for. In the stories we tell them as very small children, we have people kissing frogs and they turn into princes. Children are very malleable and very open to suggestion. So they don't, I think, struggle with these concepts nearly to the extent that it's perceived.
And Melam, how would you like to see, how do you like to see, what would you like seeing done to change mentalities in the Middle East? How can we evolve?
I guess we should work more to incorporate the transgender issue within the gender debate in general in Middle East, and we have to work hard with different communities from a human rights perspective. Maybe I see things from different view what other things, but we need to give respect and dignity for all citizens inside the society and help to reduce different kind of pressure and psychological consequences of discrimination. And for that, we need to show the others that these people are facing challenges and problems, and this comes the role of media and different organizations to show that these people are prostitutes because of blah, blah, blah. They are not born to be prostitute. So we need more support from groups. Other guests talked about allies, which is very important as well in any human rights movement to have allies. And we need a lot of work from outside as well, from the UN itself, as if we talk about hierarchies, and then inside governments and parliaments. We need the debate and discussions to be more fluid and to involve more people inside the debate.
Well, thank you. Well, that's it, but it is shocking and sad to hear that people are being shamed, discriminated against, tortured and killed for no other reason than expressing their true selves. Whatever you feel about transgender people, if we can take anything from today's discussion, it's perhaps to reflect on how we define gender. Creativity, intuition and sensitivity are feminine traits, but can a man not possess them? Likewise, assertiveness, rationality and pragmatism are often attributed to men, but can a woman not exhibit these? Life is more fluid than rigid labels, and we have to acknowledge and respect that we are not all the same. Everyone should have the right and freedom to live authentic and happy lives. I'd like to thank all my guests today, Bradley Secker, Sagi Gahraman, Yiska Smith, Nicola Silva. Also, a special thanks to the Kaleidoscope Trust and Trans Media Watch. Finally, I'm grateful to my guests in the studio with me, Fatima and Melhem. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Until next time, goodbye.